Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
I had a bad dream the other night. I dreamed that I was an intern at the Income Tax Department of the Government of India, and my boss told me to go and make a list of every tax that was applied by either the states or the center anywhere in India. So I went to the auditing department, and the guy across the table looked at me and sniggered. "What's so funny?" I asked. "Nothing," he said, and he opened a drawer. Then he took out a big roll of toilet paper and handed it to me. "What's this?" I said. "It's a list of taxes," he said. And indeed, in very small font size, there was a list of Indian taxes on it. I started reading, and as I did so, the roll of toilet paper started unspooling. The list went on and on and on, and soon the whole room was covered with toilet paper.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, my weekly podcast on the seen and unseen effects of public policy. In The Lord of the Rings, the real hero of the story is not Frodo Baggins, but the ring he is after, the one ring to rule them all. Well, today's episode is about the one tax to rule them all, the GST. The GST, or the Goods and Services Tax, is one central tax that is meant to replace a massive list of many other taxes at the state level. On the face of it, it's a great idea. So many different taxes create compliance issues and thus avenues for corruption. They drive up prices and hurt the consumers. They create friction in trade, which hurts the economy. So here's a seen effect of the GST. The GST consolidates a whole bunch of different taxes. It simplifies life for businesses, thus potentially lowering costs for consumers. Now, the GST hasn't been passed in India yet, and what was just described as a seen effect of the GST is essentially the intended effect. And the unseen effects I will now talk about also haven't happened yet, but are some of the possible unintended consequences that might just take place given the way things are unfolding. To discuss this, I've got as a guest on the show today Devangshu Datta, an economic analyst who is also a columnist for the Business Standard. Devangshu, tell me what's so great about the GST?
Look, in theory, it's an extremely nice idea. It's probably the best thing to have come out of the European Union, in the sense that you take 10 countries, 12 countries, 20 countries, whatever it is now, and they all have borders, they all have internal checkpoints, they all have different tax and excise systems. So the brilliant idea here is that you impose one tax and excise system across these 11 countries. You no longer need the internal borders. And if you don't have the internal borders, your goods can move faster and with much less in the way of paperwork and friction. So, for example, if, say, the Poles are sending something to Belgium, it might be crossing 3 countries on the way, but the truck wouldn't be stopped anywhere in those 3 countries. And to make it work, you need a very good computerized backend where everything can be reconciled and handled, but India does have that. We have 23 states and I think umpteen union territories as well, and each of them has a different internal state excise and tax system. In fact, it takes longer to send something from, say, Bangalore to Bombay directly by road, and that's just one border, essentially the Karnataka-Maharashtra border that you're crossing, and the Bombay-Octroi at city limits. Then, you could actually send goods quicker to Colombo and let a ship take it out from Sri Lanka and drop it in Bombay Harbour, then directly send it by road. And that sort of problem multiplies when you're talking 5 states, say, sending something from, again, let's say from Kerala to UP is an insanely complex thing because you have trucks held up at every state border. You have local state excise officers insisting on inspecting every cargo, every manifest. A lot of speed money has to change hands. And there's a lot of friction in the system. Now, if you could get rid of this friction, it would be, for the first time, India would actually be one market. So in theory, it's an extremely good idea. The thing is, of course, that India is also a federal state. It has, the states have specific powers to raise taxes. And to a degree, their financial independence depends on their ability to raise taxes. So by imposing a centrally administered tax rate, you are essentially asking the states to give up a certain amount of their financial independence, and the carrot here is that you can tell them that eventually you will gain, because as trade improves, every state in the nation should eventually be gaining, and also a commitment from the center to divide the revenues from the central tax equitably. These are, again, in theory, very nice things. In practice, with half a dozen regional parties and a lot of political, let's say a shifting flow of political alliances, it's taken 6 or 7 years to work through this. And one of the problems with GST is that, unlike its younger brother, value-added tax, you actually need to get more or less every state on board to start making this thing work. With VAT, you could actually say that, okay, 6 states make it work, and then the other states came on board slowly. Here, unfortunately, if you're transporting goods from Kerala to UP, even if UP and Kerala agree to be part of the GST, if Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, which come in between on Chhattisgarh, do not want to be part of GST, they'll go through the same issues of being stopped at borders. So you need it to essentially be an all-India scheme. They've managed to get that finally to sort of happen. It's still not clear whether that will happen, but at least the constitutional hurdle of states being willing to give up their powers, that has gone through. Now you're only fighting about the rather important details of what exactly this tax will be. And that is where the next set of problems in negotiations.
So,
arise.
to sum it up, essentially, you would say the scene effect or the intended scene effect of GST would just be to reduce all the friction along borders. And while India has been one country since 1947, we've been a whole bunch of different markets. And by turning it into one market, we'll make it cheaper for the consumer and easier for businesses to function. One of the unseen effects you pointed out is that states lose some of the independence and competitiveness they get from a federal structure where they can compete with each other and set their own taxes and so on. Do you feel that this is per se, regardless of consequences, on principle a bad thing? Because governance, as we have seen through history, works best when it is as local as possible. So to actually centralize something like this and not allow states to set their own rules.
I agree that there is always going to be a large problem with an imperial centralized structure. But if such a system can be made to work across Europe, which, don't forget, had so many internal wars as well happening over such a long period, and it's worked pretty well, it would be the best reason for the European Union to exist would be the fact that you have essentially a GST type system. So I suppose if sovereign nations can decide that we will live with this, you can probably make it happen in the Indian context. But yes, it has to be voluntary, and it has to be carefully negotiated so that the states feel comfortable with this process of.
In theory, GST sounds great, but implementing it in practice, it's taken many years to come to where it's at. It's gone through many compromises in the political process. The political economy is messy and complicated with so many states and parties and competing interests. What are the sort of unseen effects that this can lead to?
Well, first, even Europe went through 2 years of chaos putting it together. We have arguably as good computer systems, and we have that experience to say that there are certain mistakes maybe we won't make because the Europeans made it, and we'd look at best practices. However, that apart, what we are going to end up with for a while is an extremely compromised system where, first of all, states do not want to get rid of their right to tax specifically high-value items like alcohol, tobacco, and petroleum products. Those three things they would like exemptions on. And if you have that, then in a sense, if you look at the Indian revenue, the indirect tax revenue breakups, those three things are extremely important. Second, instead of having essentially the European GST works because they have very few tax slabs. They have, I think, a total of 3 slabs, which is one for goods, one for services, and a third for special items.
Very clear.
In India, we already have 4 slabs, plus a commitment to a 5th slab, and in effect a 6th slab, and maybe a 7th. So if you have a GST which is spread across 7 different slabs, and I'm not including zero tax items in this, it will be incredibly messy and complex system to implement, because in a sense, any sort of GST works on a VAT principle that I pay for a car, and the chap who manufactures the car is taxed on the value of what he's adding to the 30,000 or 50,000 parts which he's bought and sourced from the market, and the expenses he's had in terms of labor to put it together, blah, blah. So if you have that sort of thing happening, and every one of those 30,000 items then have to be classified under 7 different categories, and taxes calculated on that. Again, in theory, yes, of course, a computer can do this, but in practice, it will be an extremely complicated and very AI, artificial intelligence dependent process, where, in a sense, even an assessing officer will not be able to tell you offhand what is going on. That's one problem. The second thing is that you have exemptions, where essentially state governments are still going to be imposing their own taxes, which means that in a sense lorries will be stopped at the border of every state, and this whole process of checking your manifesto and a 5-kilometer long queue while manifests are being checked and cargoes are being inspected visually, etc., and of course the associated corruption that goes with this whole process, that doesn't disappear. The state excise and revenue departments remain live departments. It isn't as though the officers are going to be given a pension and told to go away or absorbed in different departments. They will stay in uniform and they will continue to hold up trucks. So those frictions will remain for a while, at least for the next 3 to 5 years. Second, given demonetization, this entire process of negotiation may well break down, and break down for very rational reasons. One of the areas which the center does not have any sort of say in is stamp duty. That's imposed on land, and it's collected by every state, which sets its own circle rates and things. And for reasons which we all know, but let's not elaborate, the real estate market has frozen. The secondary real estate market essentially does not exist at this point of time, and whenever it does come back, there is a fairly good chance that it will be depressed in terms of value for a while. If that happens, the states lose stamp duty revenue. if they lose stamp duty revenue and they anticipate losses of revenue at least for the first couple of years on GST, most of them do not want to be placed in a position where they'll be running at fiscal deficits which will actually erode their bargaining power versus the center. A state which has, in fact we've seen this, a state which has reasonably sound finances, a Tamil Nadu or a Maharashtra, has, regardless of the government at the center vis-a-vis the government at the state, it has a lot of bargaining power because they can manage their own finances. Essentially, Tamil Nadu or Gujarat or Maharashtra could be independent countries, maybe not very prosperous independent countries, but they run reasonably balanced budgets. They earn their own revenue, and in that sense, they do not need central intervention. A Bihar can't. A Bihar is, or a Jharkhand is much more dependent on the center. And if you have a scenario where, quite rationally, a lot of states anticipate a crunch in terms of internal revenue collections, they would rather not have the GST happening. So I think there will be a further sequence of negotiations where it could break down. And of course, a redefinition of powers as it happens. So what if it is implemented at all, it will be a very messy implementation. Otherwise, if there's a breakdown in negotiations, well, essentially, as the bill stands right now, if it's not implemented by 30th September 2017, they would need to run a new set of bills through Parliament. And again, it is going to be touch and go whether, because this is a constitutional bill, you are dealing with center-state relationships, the Rajya Sabha has to vote on it separately. It's not a money bill. Even though it's all about money, it is not a money bill. You have to push it through the Rajya Sabha where the state representatives have to agree to give up their power. And whether you can make that happen a second time if this bill lapses is, well, let's say it's likely to be doubtful. Also, likely to be doubtful whether any sane central administration will want to impose GST going into a general election, because you have a huge problem if you anticipate even 1 year of chaos, and at the end of it you don't know where your finances will be, and you don't know what sort of impact that will have on specific areas. Why would you want to take the risk going into a general election?
So let me try and sum up the sort of unseen effects that you've spoken about. Number one is because of the potentially 7 different kind of categories and because of the multiple numerous exemptions that exist, the process will actually become even messier than it is now perhaps. There will be a lot of discretion given to government officials. The rent seeking will continue. The friction at the state borders will continue. You will still know when you approach a state border by car, by the line of trucks that you see that, this must be a state border. And the second unseen effect is really where the states fear losing their independence because they're already hurt by the loss of stamp duty due to demonetization. And if they can't maintain a balanced budget, they lose a lot of the bargaining power they have vis-a-vis the center, and you almost reach an imperial sort of system where the states have less power.
Essentially.
Now, so my question to you is that given that within the political economy we are in with so many states and so many parties and so many different competing interests, that this kind of messy process was almost inevitable. Was a GST a good idea in India in the first place? And if so, how would you have done it differently?
I think you'd have had to find a way to live with 3 rates. And note that right now I'm just talking about the G. They still haven't worked out what the S rate is going to be. And that is also going to, because...
Can you elaborate on that, G and S?
Yeah, of course. They worked out goods rates. They worked out a 0 rate.
Right.
4 rates of 5%, 12%, 18% and 28%.
Right.
There will be another rate which will be imposed specifically on bullion and precious stones.
Right.
That has not yet been negotiated. Right. There will be a cess on top of the 28% items which are luxury items, etc. which will be imposed in order to raise money for the anticipated losses that states will face in terms of revenue for the first 2 to 5 years. This cess is supposed to have a time-bound thing, that it'll only happen for 2 years or whatever. But you know what happens in India. Reservations were supposed to be time-bound. So we don't know how that'll happen. And they haven't yet gotten down to brass tacks working out the service tax rates. Now, the service tax rates, as you all know, is about 14.5%. However, you have perfectly rational people saying that, well, there is a difference between, say, an oncologist versus a civil engineer versus a pizza delivery guy. They're all performing services, undoubtedly, but there is pretty much a difference. So should that be reflected in a service tax rate? If you decide that it should be reflected in a service tax rate, again, do you arguably a Flipkart which is based in Bangalore, if it's acting as a delivery boy and delivering something to you in Delhi, it is a service, so it should have a service tax component. But if you have a service tax component, what should that service tax component be? So this back and forth is going on. So they don't even, apart from the goods rates, which are still subject to reclassifications, they haven't yet worked out the service tax rates at all. So I think that is where you have a real problem happening now, in that you need to sit down and say, look, you cannot have 7 different rates or 10 different rates just because the current system has 7 different or 10 different rates or 20 different rates. GST works essentially because it simplifies the system. You have to, find a median rate, whatever that median rate is, which is reasonably satisfactory, and crunch it and just let it happen. I mean, shrug your shoulders and say, okay, maybe service tax should be 16%, and let it go for a year. If 16% turns out to be too high, then cut it back.
So just a further question, to go back to the goods rates, for example, just a G part of it. You said there are 4 existing rates with 3 more potential rates in 3 different categories possibly coming up. Now, why is this? Who asked for these different rates? Because
they tried to, essentially because our state excise systems have, even our central tax systems have these extremely complicated classifications and reclassifications of goods. So when they started negotiating for this, instead of throwing that out of the window and saying that let's have a simplified system, they said no, we call cars luxury items, so we have to have a rate which...
But who said? Who is the interest group which is protesting this?
Well, every interest group obviously is involved. All the manufacturers associations and the traders associations have lobbied. At the same time, central and state government finance ministers have put their feet down and said that, well, we charge a lot. We charge a high amount on, let's say, electronic items or cars. So we want that to have that higher amount should be charged in the in the GST. So it should be at 28%. At the same time, it's a classification which is electronic items but not computers and mobile phones. So you are running into subcategories of classification, because computers are, I think, charged at the lowest rate or at 0. I'm not quite sure, but it's an extremely low rate. Whereas, say, a microwave oven could be having a 35% or 40% tax on it, given the combination of central and state excises. Now, essentially, a microwave is a dumb computer. It has a chip in it, and, the rest of it it's just faff. But you have at some stage decided to make these peculiar distinctions, and you continue making these peculiar distinctions, even though you had a chance and you could have actually said that let's converge to some average rate which seems reasonable. Let's cut it down to 3 different items, sinful items, non-sinful items, and essential items. Essential items, for example, food is zero tax.
Right.
Books are zero tax. Physical books are. Now,
They're charging you for downloading Kindle books.
yeah,
This will bankrupt me.
yeah. So, I mean, at least they're contemplating charging you for downloading Kindle books. And again, books are free, but music cassettes are not. A computer program is not. Well, again, certain categories of computer programs are free, but games are not. So, I mean, zero tax versus games not being zero tax. So, if you have some man sitting there somewhere in a, Sarkari office making these distinctions for what might or might not seem rational reasons.
Right. So, one final question now. Given that we can't just create a utopian world where we design everything absolutely perfectly and we have to work within the limitations of the system, supposing Narendra Modi was to walk in the door and say, Devangshu, I've made many mistakes, but I've finally met you, so I'm going to take you to this time machine and you're going to come back in time with me to 2014 and you are going to run my GST policy. Should we have a GST? Should we let taxes stay there? If we try to get a GST through, how should we design it? What are the kind of compromises we can make and we cannot make? What would you then do as a policymaker? What would you do differently?
I would have pared it down to 3 rates. I would have told the states that we'll calculate a shadow rate based on the income you would have made on every item and the old thing, and we'll figure out a way of compensating you. Instead of looking for a constitutional amendment, I would have made it some sort of tripartite deal with maybe the RBI or maybe even the World Bank standing in as a interlocutor and guarantor for this particular financial transaction. That shadow tolling happens, for example, on roads, where you say that, well, we won't make this a toll road because it's public policy. We want to connect point A to point B and we're not going to toll it. However, the guy that builds it will count every vehicle that wanders down the road, and we'll figure out at the end of the year or every quarter or whatever it is, every 2 weeks, as the case may be, how much revenue there would have been, and we'll pay that revenue. So shadow tolling, I would have tried. You're asking me this question out of the blue, but I would have tried doing something like that, figuring out a shadow tolling, a shadow tax system where if it's stuck with the old system, this is what the... And you have to... Anyway, it may sound complicated, but anyway, this is a comparison you have to make to find out...
At some point.
To find out whether GST makes sense or not. So I would have said that we'll do that, and, we'll compensate you if it turns out that you're making, that you are foregoing revenues under GST. And if it turns out that you're not foregoing revenues and you're actually ending up better off, or we are ending up better off at the end of it, well, then the center keeps the money.
Right.
If you like, this is a two-way bet. If the GST works, the center actually ends up with a surplus and the states end up with the same money that they would have made anyway.
Right.
And you remove the...
And if the GST doesn't work, the states get the money they would have made anyway,
get the money,
the center loses a little bit.
The center loses something.
Yeah. So they take the onus of GST on themselves,
the
which
risk
would make the state more agreeable to...
The risk would be the centers.
Right.
And you'd ask them to, to dismantle your state excise services, or cut it down to one chap who doesn't necessarily stop trucks. You're going digital anyway, so, this guy, as the truck approaches you, he can basically SMS you his manifest.
Right.
And you enter it and you carry on.
Thanks a lot, Devangshu. Pleasure talking to you.
The GST is deeply complicated. It may or may not actually pass this year. But even if it does, it's useful to remember that it's had such a convoluted development that it may not achieve much of what its designers would like. It is always good to be forewarned. On that note, I shall sign off from the show. See you next week.
Next week, on The Seen and the Unseen, Amit Varma will be talking to Shikha Dalmia about immigration. For more, check out seenunseen.in.
If you enjoyed listening to The Seen and the Unseen,
Check out another great show by IVM Podcast, Made in India, hosted by my friend May Thomas, where every week she profiles up-and-coming independent Indian bands.
Hey man, just help me out, man. I need some podcast, man. I haven't had a fix in a week. Just need some.
Don't you worry about it. I got podcast galore for you, man. Just go to ivmpodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thanks, man. I'm gonna check it out.